All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Excited to be here for another week, another Torah portion discussion. This week's Torah portion is Parshas Behaalosecha or Behaalosecha. The Torah portion discusses many issues, and we'll quickly run through this week's Torah portion and an overview of this week's Parsha. Aaron the high priest is commanded to raise light in the lamps of the menorah, and the tribe of Levi is initiated into the service in the sanctuary. Very powerful beginning to this week's Parsha. The Torah portion then continues with the story of the second Passover and how it was instituted. It's instituted in response to the petition of a few Jews of why should we be deprived by a group of Jews who are unable to bring the Passover offering in its appointed time because they were ritually impure. God instructs Moshe on the procedures for Israel's journey and encampments in the desert, and the people journey in formation from Mount Sinai, where they had been camped for nearly a year. The people are dissatisfied with their bread from heaven, the manna, and demand that Moshe supply them with meat. There we are, the complainers. Stiff-necked nation. Moshe, the leader of the Jewish people, appoints 70 elders to whom he imparts of his spirit to assist him in the burden of governing the people. Miriam, Moshe's older sister, speaks negatively of Moshe. Right? That's what older sisters are there for. Keep us in check. And is punished with leprosy. Moshe prays for her healing, and the entire community waits 7 days for her recovery. That waiting was before they moved on to continue on their journey in the desert. At this point, their journey in the desert is still to head straight to the promised land in short order. And in the coming Torah portions, we will have the stories that cause them to continue for the 40 years wandering in the desert. That's the overview of this week's Parsha, but we're going to zero in on a unique aspect of this week's Torah portion, which is associated with the Passover sacrifice. Now, yes, it's not Passover, but that's what's discussed in this week's Torah portion. They say the story of Getzel. Getzel was the painter of Chelm. Chelm is famously known for having overly smart people. And so he was the painter of Chelm, and he was about to go swimming, and he figured, you know what, when I go swimming, I'm not going to have much on me. How am I going to know who's me? When I'm a painter, I know who I am. I look at my clothing, I see strokes of paint, I see them all over me. I know I'm the painter. But if I don't have my clothing, how am I going to know who I am? How am I going to know I'm Getzel the painter? So he comes up with a genius idea. He takes this little red ribbon, ties it around his big toe, his big right toe, and he goes swimming. As fate would have it, the red string swims off his toe, and in a short order, it lands on the toe of someone else. Comes out of the swimming pool a short while later, and he's shocked to see that he doesn't have the red string. He looks around and he sees someone else has the red string. He runs over to him and he says, look, I know who you are, but who am I? When it comes to our personality, who are we? There's really two tracks we can take. There's the track of individuality. I am who I am. And then there's the idea of the broader community, the idea of collectivism. I am part of a greater being. I am part of a greater community. Now, when it comes to throughout history, in times of old, a much greater focus was put on the nationality of people, the community they belonged to, the religion they belonged to, the race, etc. Nowadays, especially in the Western culture, it's all about individuality. Your own personality, our own characteristics, who we are, what we like doing, and so on and so forth. And so what we're going to discuss today is a unique perspective gleaned from this week's Torah portion on what is Judaism's perspective about individualism in the context of the broader community. And so we'll begin with a passage from this week's Torah portion that discusses the anniversary of the first year out of Egypt. And what does God tell them to do? God commands them to bring the Paschal sacrifice. So the Paschal sacrifice was brought in Egypt. Just before they left Egypt, just before the Exodus, they brought the Paschal sacrifice. Exactly a year later, they didn't know if they should bring the Paschal sacrifice or not, because it was something that they did only once. It was something that they did in Egypt. And so God gives them this command in this week's Torah portion to bring the Paschal sacrifice that second year, not just for the second year, but for eternity. It is a commandment to bring the Paschal sacrifice. Text 1a, if you have the book, it's on page 125. God spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert in the second year of their exodus from the land of Egypt in the first month, the month of Nisan, saying, "The children of Israel shall make the Passover sacrifice in its appointed time, which is on the eve of Passover on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. On the afternoon of the 14th of this month, you shall make it in its appointed time. In accordance with all its statutes and all its ordinances, you shall make it." Moshe spoke to the children of Israel, instructing them to make the Passover sacrifice. So they made the Passover sacrifice in the first month, on the afternoon of the 14th day of the month in the Sinai desert, according to all that Hashem had commanded Moshe, so did the children of Israel do. What day was this Paschal sacrifice brought? The Karban Pesach, as it's known in Hebrew, the Pesach sacrifice. What day was it? Was it a Sunday? Was it a Tuesday? Was it a Wednesday? And the interesting thing is that on this first Paschal sacrifice, it was actually a Shabbos. That means Saturday night was going to be the first Seder, as it was this year. Sunday was the first day of Passover. That year, the first year that they were out of Egypt, Passover began on a Sunday, which meant that when were they to bring the Paschal lamb? Saturday afternoon. And it's actually from a verse in this week's Torah portion that Rashi, our favorite commentary, the 11th century sage from France, Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki, comments, quoting from the Talmud, "You shall make it in its appointed time." And Rashi highlights that this nuance in the verse is teaching us that even if it were to fall on the Shabbos. And so the sacrifice had to be brought specifically on Shabbos. There was a minor difference, and that was that there were a few different laws when it came to a Paschal sacrifice on Shabbos versus a Paschal sacrifice that wasn't on Shabbos. You see, the Jewish people, when they would bring the Paschal sacrifice, they would bring it on the eve of Passover, the day before Passover. Then, after they do the sacrificial rites in the temple, they then carry that lamb home with them, proceed with the Seder, and at the appropriate time in the Seder, they would eat the lamb. The difference is when that happened on Shabbos, they would bring the lamb to the temple. They'd perform the sacrificial rites in the temple, and then they would have to wait until nightfall, until Shabbos ended, in order that they can now carry, because carrying in a public domain is prohibited on Shabbos. And so they would have to wait until the nightfall. Once nightfall came, they were able to carry home their Paschal lamb and begin their Seder a little bit later. Now, this idea of Pesach landing on a Sunday, and so the Paschal lamb needed to be brought on a Shabbos, was very out of the ordinary. It's very uncommon, as it is nowadays, even though nowadays we do follow on a fixed calendar. And so I can tell you when Passover will be in 35 years from now. And in those days, the calendar followed the moon, when there were witnesses who saw the moon. So they really had no idea when Pesach will be in the coming year. They couldn't even tell you a year in advance. They couldn't even tell you 3 months in advance what day Pesach would be in that year. And so even in those days, it was very, very uncommon, very rare for Pesach to be in such a calendar layout. As a matter of fact, one year when Pesach did land in that calendar layout, with the first day being Sunday, and so the Paschal lamb needed to be brought on Shabbos, There was a debate amongst the rabbis. Is it permissible to bring the Paschal lamb on Shabbos or not? And it was so rare that they had no recollection of what happened, or that the first time that Pesach happened, as it is in this week's Torah portion, is that it happened on a Shabbos. And so they had no recollection, and there was this discussion of what the law should be. Here's the quote from the Talmud, really from the Tosefta, which preceded the Talmud, but it's the same source. Text 2. One year, the 14th of Nisan, the eve of Passover, fell on the Shabbos. They asked Hillel the elder, the famous Hillel, sage Hillel, does the Passover sacrifice override the Shabbos? And he said, is there only one Passover in the year that overrides the Shabbos? There are, in fact, more than 300 Passovers in the year that override the Shabbos. Everyone in the temple gathered around him in protest. He said, the daily tamid sacrifice is a communal offering, and it overrides the Shabbos. Likewise, the Passover sacrifice is a communal offering, and it overrides the Shabbos. Moreover, I was taught by my teachers explicitly that the Passover sacrifice overrides the Shabbos. That very day, they appointed Hillel as the Nasi, the leader, and he taught the laws of the Pesach sacrifice. What's going on here? What's the debate? What's his question? What was their concern? Why wouldn't the Passover sacrifice be brought on Shabbos? Why did Hillel say it is brought on Shabbos? And why, as a result of that, did he suddenly become the Nasi, the head of the rabbinical court, which was the de facto leader of the Jewish people? What was in this answer that suddenly made him leader quality, that they unanimously appointed him to be the leader? And so we'll go through this discussion. It works as follows. There are two types of sacrifices. There's a communal sacrifice, and there's the personal sacrifice. What's a communal sacrifice? Every day in the temple, on the altar, there were two sacrifices that were brought that were communal sacrifices. It was called the tamid, the constant sacrifice. One in the morning, one in the afternoon. And as a result, we have a morning and afternoon prayer in place of the sacrifices, being that we don't have the temple. There were also communal sacrifices that were brought every Shabbos. There were communal sacrifices, that is the musaf, the additional sacrifice. So aside from the two constant sacrifices, there was the additional sacrifice. And that's why we have an additional Amida prayer on the Shabbos. On the holidays as well. On Yom Kippur, there was even more sacrifices. And on holidays like Sukkot, there was even more sacrifices that were brought. All of those were communal sacrifices. And communal sacrifices are ones that are brought on behalf of the congregation. Then there are personal sacrifices. For example, a sin offering. If God forbid someone performs a sin, they transgress a sin, they like to atone for their sin. So the law in the Torah is that they have to bring a sin offering. That's a personal sacrifice. If someone wanted to give thanks to the Almighty because something tremendous happened to them, a big blessing, they were saved, they went through a terrible medical emergency and it was miraculous that they were saved from it. They bring a thanksgiving sacrifice. A toda is the name of that. That's also a personal sacrifice. Personal sacrifice was paid for personally. The communal sacrifices were paid for by the community. The temple had coffers, and there was a system on how those coffers were filled and who would buy the sacrifices. Now there's a rule. Communal sacrifices override the Shabbos. Personal sacrifices do not override the Shabbos. That's the rule. It's a rule from the Torah. Now you may be asking why. What's the issue with the sacrifice? You're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbos. It's a law in the Torah and various other laws. Nonetheless, the Torah tells us that on Shabbos, the same Torah that says that you're not allowed to slaughter says that for communal sacrifices, you may slaughter on Shabbos. So communal sacrifices do override the Shabbos. Personal sacrifices don't. And so in turn, what Hillel was telling these people, in other words, it was a discussion, is the Paschal sacrifice a personal sacrifice or a communal sacrifice? And Hillel was telling him that it overrides the Shabbos because it's a communal sacrifice. And that's what he means by saying there are in fact more than 300 Passovers. In other words, there are more than 300 communal sacrifices yearly. And each one overrides the Shabbos. This is no different than any other communal sacrifice. Why? Why did the other rabbis feel that there was some sort of complexity to this question? And Hillel had such a simple answer. Of course, it's a communal sacrifice. Is a Passover lamb a communal sacrifice, or is it a personal sacrifice? Which would translate, does it override the Shabbos, or does it not override the Shabbos? So here's the reasoning of where it comes from. We'll quote a text from Maimonides, which seemingly implies that the Paschal sacrifice is not a communal sacrifice, it's a personal sacrifice. Here's from Maimonides in the laws of the Paschal sacrifice. It is a positive commandment to offer the Paschal sacrifice on the 14th day of the month of Nisan after midday. This offering is brought only from lambs or goats, a male in its first year. Both men and women are obligated in this mitzvah. So what's Maimonides telling us? It's an individual obligation. It's a personal sacrifice. Each individual has to bring a Paschal sacrifice. But on the other hand, there is a communal aspect to it. It wasn't like any other Paschal, private, personal sacrifice. For example, if someone wanted to bring a sin offering, they'd take a cow, a lamb, whatever animal it was. I don't recall exactly which animals were permitted for a Thanksgiving sacrifice or a sin offering. And they'd bring the animal to the temple. They'd bring it to the Kohen. The Kohen would slaughter it and put the parts, the obligated parts on the altar, and the other parts the Kohen would keep, and certain parts of the animal would be given to the owner to consume as well. An individual, Chaim, Moshe, David, Sarah, whoever had an issue or a thanksgiving would bring the sacrifice. How did it work with the Paschal sacrifice? Here's the quote from the initial Paschal lamb. Speak to the entire community of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor, who is nearest to his house, shall take one according to the number of people, each one according to one's ability to eat, shall you be counted for the lamb. It wasn't a personal sacrifice. It had to be brought with a group. As a matter of fact, even if someone, why did it have to be brought with a group? Because the lamb had to be consumed by a certain time. And a lamb is quite large. A person can consume. It's kind of hard to consume an entire lamb single-handedly. So it had to be brought with a group. But even more than that, Maimonides tells us that the law is, ideally, even if someone is able to eat an entire lamb single-handedly, almost like Nathan's hot dog race, they still should do it together with a group. It's discouraged to do it alone because it must be done with a group. As a matter of fact, that group was even larger than usual. It wasn't just the groups to conclude to eat this individual lamb. It didn't work that each group would come to the temple, enter the courtyard, give their lamb to the Kohen. The Kohen would do the sacrificial rites, and then they take the lamb back home to have the Seder. It didn't work that way. There were only 3 communal Paschal lamb groups that entered the temple. How did that work? The Talmud tells us, text 5, the Paschal lamb was slaughtered in 3 groups, as the verse states, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. In other words, the verse gives 3 collective terms to the Jewish people. The whole assembly, the congregation, and Israel. It could have just said, and the whole of Israel shall slaughter it. It could have said, and the whole assembly of Israel. It could have said, and could have said the whole congregation of Israel. The fact that it uses all 3 terms, assembly, congregation, and Israel, implies that it should be 3 groups. How would this 3-group system work? The first group of people sacrificing the offering entered, and when the temple courtyard filled, they closed the doors of the temple courtyard. They all entered the temple courtyard. Not just one lamb group, but a whole bunch of groups entered until they couldn't have anyone else in it. The doors were closed. They preceded the sacrifices. After their sacrifices were finished, the first group exited and the second group entered. After their sacrifices were finished, the second group left and the third group entered. So we see the sacrifice of the Korban Pesach had a very, very communal feel to it. And so this was the debate between Hillel the elder and the other sages who are referred to as Bnei Beseira. They were a group of sages who were the leaders of the Jewish people at that time. And Hillel the elders and Bnei Beseira had this confusion. Do we say that it's a that the Paschal lamb is a communal sacrifice because of its communal elements, or do we say it's a personal sacrifice because it has personal elements? And what difference does it make? Can you bring the Paschal lamb on a Shabbos or not? So Hillel reinstated the law, and Hillel was telling us that initially this was always the law and it was just forgotten because it was so uncommon for it to happen. But really this was the way it always was, as we see it. That was actually the first Paschal sacrifice. The Bnei Beseira, the other leaders of the Jewish people at the time, were confused. And Hillel set the record. He set it straight. Why did he choose this opinion? Why did he say that we follow the communal aspects of the sacrifice, and we consider it a communal sacrifice? And even more than that, why was that decision the one that made him the leader of the Jewish people? Now let's analyze Hillel for a moment. Who was Hillel? Hillel was not someone you'd expect to become the Nasi. Now his name is synonymous with Judaism. Everyone knows Hillel the Elder. There are great institutions that carry his name. There are great ideas that carry his name. Don't do unto others what you don't think is nice. The rest is commentary. Go and study. That's a great statement from Hillel the Elder. And so Hillel is arguably one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people of all time. But who was Hillel? He was a Babylonian immigrant who arrived in Israel, penniless, had nowhere to go, but he ached for the study of Torah. He became a wood chopper, and with his meager earnings, he'd pay the 2 kopecks or whatever it was at the time that would allow him the entry fee into the academy to study Torah. At one point, business was going so bad, he didn't even make those meager pennies. And the study hall noticed that there's someone on top of their roof. And when they climbed on top, they found an unconscious Hillel who was so thirsty to study Torah that even though he didn't have those pennies, it was freezing cold. But he was willing to sacrifice his life to study Torah. And so from that day on, they allowed him in, free of charge, no entry fee. If I'm not mistaken, they abolished the entry fee at that point. because they saw that if someone's willing so hard to go and study Torah, they'll abolish the entry fee in its entirety, even though that paid for the upkeep of the institution. Either way, so he entered the academy. He had to study despite the uncomfort, and he proved himself to be a brilliant student and then a teacher. And he became known for his exceptional kindness, his patience, his wisdom, as we know from the stories that are told about him. As a matter of fact, from when he became the leader of the Jewish people, his descendants for 14 generations remained the leaders of the Jewish people until the year 425 of the Common Era, roughly about 1600 years ago, give or take a few years, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, who was the 14th generation from Hillel the elder, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya IV, he passed away, and the Romans refused to allow a new Jewish leader with the hope that the Jewish people will disintegrate without having a leader. And here we are to prove them wrong. But either way, this was Hillel, who really came from nothing. And so he really did not fit the bill to become the leader of the Jewish people. But it's this debate that pushed him over the edge, that encouraged the sages to kind of demote Bnei Beseira, who were the leaders collectively of the Jewish people at the time, and promote Hillel to be the Nasi. Why is that? So here we go. Here's a quote from Shemos, the book of Exodus, discussing the Paschal sacrifice, and it'll give us some inkling into what their debate was about. Text 6. Moshe summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Draw forth or buy for yourselves sheep for your families and slaughter the Passover sacrifice. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and immerse it in the blood that is in the basin, and you shall extend to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts the blood that is in the basin, and you shall not go out any man from the entrance of his house until morning." Bnei Beseira said, look at this text. This is the first commandment that the Jewish people received. What was the commandment that they received? To stay indoors. They were on lockdown. They were on lockdown. Stay indoors. They were all there individually. And so the rabbis, Bnei Beseira, said that if the initial sacrifice was a private event, it was hyper-individual. So yes, it was their little group of their individual family, but they had to be on lockdown. That shows that the essence of the sacrifice is a personal sacrifice, and if so, it cannot be brought on Shabbos. Hillel, on the other hand, said, no. Look at what happened the second year. What is the second year? The second year is the commandment to bring the Paschal sacrifice for eternity as the mitzvah. And what does the second year show us? That it has to be brought as a group, and everyone has to go together to the temple, and the temple gets filled to capacity 3 times, and only then can they go back home to have their Seder with the Paschal lamb. It's a communal Seder that definitely has personal components to it, but it's a communal sacrifice. And if it's a communal sacrifice, even if some of the features are personal, we follow the laws of communal sacrifice, and if so, it can be brought on Shabbos. And the law follows Hillel the elder. It's considered a communal sacrifice and it's brought on Shabbos. What's this got to do with you and me? God willing, this coming year we'll bring a Paschal sacrifice with the coming of Mashiach in our holy temple. But what does that have to do with us today? Here, in the month of Sivan, we're not bringing a Paschal sacrifice. When Mashiach comes today, we're still not going to bring a Paschal sacrifice for another few months. What does it have to do with you and me? What does this teach us? And also the original question of why did Hillel become the leader of the Jewish people because of this ruling? Hillel is teaching us a very, very important part of becoming a people. You see, the Jewish people received this commandment of bringing the Paschal sacrifice at the birth of them as a nation. And Hillel was telling us that in order to become a nation, the very first step is to develop the individual, every single person's identity. Just like the first Paschal sacrifice in Egypt was a very personal, private affair. When you're just starting out on the journey of self-actualization, even if it is as becoming a community, each individual has to first recognize, who am I before I go ahead and become a greater community, right? We've all flown, and we may have not flown recently, but we've all been on a plane. And what do they tell you on the plane? In those boring speeches that you hear as an introduction to your flight, some flights like to make them a little bit more entertaining, but they always say, if the oxygen masks fall down, please put your mask on first before you help others. You got to know who you are before you go ahead and become part of a greater community. And so therefore, Judaism emphasizes the role of the individual and the importance of each individual utilizing their own character traits and their own talents and qualities. This idea comes up in many, many places. One place that it comes up is with the 12 tribes. The Torah stresses the idea of the Jewish people as a community, and it's constantly talking about the Jewish people, but you know what? When they encamped highly individual. Each one of the 12 tribes had their own place, as we learned in previous Torah portions. They had their own place, they had their own flag, and it was very, very strict. Not only was very strict, it's mentioned in the Torah how strict the Jews were with keeping to their individuality, each one as a tribe. So Judaism does not aspire to sameness. The idea that we're all equal, we're all equally important, who we are with our differences. Each one of the 12 tribes had to be an individual tribe with their own uniqueness, their own flag, their own color, their own personality. And their personalities varied. Each tribe collectively had a different personality. They expressed a different attribute. Here's a quote from an early Hasidic sage. Page 131, text 7, who explains this concept, this idea of the individuality of each one of the 12 tribes. On the verse, and Balaam saw Israel dwelling by their tribes, Rashi comments, he saw each tribe dwelling separately, not intermingled. What is the virtue in this? And he explains. Avraham, our forefather Abraham, served Hashem more through love than awe, as his soul emanated from the attribute of chesed, divine kindness. Isaac, Yitzchak, his son, served more through awe than love, inasmuch as his soul was from the divine attribute of gevura, strength, and discipline. Jacob, the third one of our patriarchs, Yaakov, served with tiferet, compassion. In the same way, each person ought to know their respective soul's potential so that they can serve God according to their potential, according to the divine attribute in which their soul is rooted. And he continues, so it was with the tribes. Reuven's soul stemmed from the attributes of love and kindness, as did all the souls of his tribe. They knew that their primary service was love of God. Shimon's soul was rooted in the attribute of discipline, as were all souls of his tribe. Awe of Hashem was a dominant aspect of their service. Each tribe knew its path in the service of Hashem. Now, however, the tribes are intermingled and people simply adopt the ways of their neighbors. This is the deeper meaning of, and Balaam saw Israel dwelling by their tribes. Each tribe recognized its uniqueness and served God according to its potential. Had they been intermingled, each would have imitated the other, even though such service would have no correlation to the root of their souls and would have offered their souls no rectification. So what do we have here? What we have here is this beautiful idea of individualism. This idea that we all have to know exactly who we are, dig deeply into our souls to know what the root of our soul is and follow that in our service of God. Some of us may be better in the love of God. Others may be better in having awe of God. All are important, but where do we excel in? What area do we excel in? It's not that the other is not important. It's not that we don't have to practice the other. But where's the source of my soul? Each tribe came from a different source. And the souls of everyone in that tribe came from a different source. And so they were separated. They did not intermingle. They kept separate while they traveled and while they encamped in the desert and so on. In Israel, they each had a separate parcel of land. Expressing this idea of individualism. The first Paschal sacrifice was a private affair, a personal affair, because in order to have a community, first you have to have the knowledge of who am I, the power of the individual. And that's what Hillel is teaching us. That this idea of what do we prioritize, personal identity or communal identity, it's really a two-step process. This is the first of the two-step process. But that's only one part of the process. Our individual identity, figuring it out, working on it, building it up is only one step of the process. What's the second step of the process? That's where the second Paschal sacrifice came in. What was the second Paschal sacrifice? That was the communal aspect of the Paschal sacrifice. It's the same Paschal sacrifice, but it's the one that focuses more on the communal aspect. Because as we grow as an individual, we learn to value the collective in addition to the individual. Why is that? Because ultimately, my individuality, my identity, is more about my family, my community, and my faith than it is about my interests and my hobbies and my personal strengths. And we can see this in the world around us. People are a lot more passionate about religion, about race, about country than they are about hiking. And they are about collecting stamps, and they are about playing Candy Crush or whatever it is. When we talk about ourselves, yes, we may be what we do for our profession, but who am I? I'm Jewish. I'm an American. I do so on and so forth. But who am I? I'm Jewish. I'm part of a greater community. It precedes what we do. It precedes our hobbies, which may change. It precedes our profession, which may change. It's our essence. It's our core identity. I am a Jew, part of the collective Jewish people. Without a sense of collective identity, it can cause serious issues of loneliness, meaninglessness, rootlessness, without having a community, without having a family, without having a faith. Can cause not such good things. And so Hillel is teaching us that yes, we first have to work on the personal identity, but personal identity must be anchored in the collective identity. And anchoring our personal identity in a communal identity also ensures that we have a healthy self-esteem. What do I mean by that? I say the story of a Hasidic Jew who came from the shtetl, and he arrived in the United States in the early 20th century. And he writes a letter to his family back in the shtetl, and he says that when I arrived in the New World, I discovered that I had a serious disease that I had no idea about. And that was that I am suffering from a deficiency in self-esteem. What's a healthy self-esteem? It's important to nurture a healthy self-esteem, but it's also important not to be greedy, not to have a big ego, self-aggrandizement. These are things that are not so good to have. So how do we make that balance? How do we create that equal balance of having a healthy self-esteem without it being unchecked and leading to greed and ego and other issues? We do that when we recognize that our self-esteem is not only about ourselves. In other words, we have to ask ourselves, why is it important to focus on my needs and wants? If it's important to focus on my needs and wants just because it's all about me, then that's a problem. Because then my self-esteem can lead me to do things that are not good, can lead me to have a big ego, can lead me to self-aggrandizement, can lead me to greed. But if I want myself to have a healthy self-esteem, because then I can help others, then I can do better for the greater good, then I can do better for the world around me, for my family, for my community, for my country, whatever it may be. Then it's not about me. My personal identity is rooted in the communal identity. Then I can have a healthy self-esteem without it leading into it getting to my head. And that's what Hillel is teaching us with the Paschal sacrifice. That it's these two steps. The first Paschal sacrifice had a lot of personal aspects to it. The second Paschal sacrifice was that second step now is the community, the communal aspect to it. And Hillel put it very succinctly and powerfully in his famous statement from the Ethics of Our Fathers. Now, the Ethics of Our Fathers, traditionally, we begin studying it every single week following the holiday of Passover, following the bringing of the Paschal sacrifice. And what do we study in the Ethics of Our Fathers in the first chapter? Text 8. Hillel would also say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? What's his first statement? If I am not for myself, who is for me? I got to know who I am. I got to be there for myself. I got to show up for myself. But we can't stop there. That's just the first step. The second step is, if I am only for myself, what am I? I have to be there for the community. I'm part of a collective goal. I'm part of a collective identity. And so the Rebbe explains, and we'll get to the third idea in a moment, that really these three lines, what Hillel is telling us, are three comments about the Pesach sacrifice on Shabbos saga. The first statement is the first Paschal sacrifice, the idea of the personal aspects of Paschal sacrifice. The second statement, and if I am only for myself, what am I? Is the communal identity of the Paschal sacrifice. Because if we don't have the communal aspect of it, who am I? What am I? Even if I know who I am, I'm worthless if I don't have that anchor in the communal aspect of it. Really, there's a homiletical explanation to that statement, with Hillel is saying about himself, and if I am only for myself, in other words, if not for the communal aspect that I ascribe to the Paschal sacrifice, thereby permitting it to override the Shabbos, then what am I? What would I, Hillel, have been? I would have been the same nobody I always was. Because I ascribe to it that it's not only for myself, in other words, that the Paschal sacrifice is also a communal sacrifice and primarily a communal sacrifice, that's what made me into who I am, the leader of the Jewish people. That's parenthetically. And this is the reason why he was suddenly appointed to become the leader of the Jewish people. Because a good leader is not just someone. What does it mean to be a good leader? A good leader is someone who can nurture individuals and their qualities and their powers and their strengths according to all their personal needs, but still focus on the shared goals of the collective unit. And by this understanding of the Paschal sacrifice, Hillel the elder proved himself to be that leader, someone who can focus on the individual needs with the focus on the collective unit. What's his third point? And if not now, when? His third point was a very simple, practical idea. Why not wait just till after the Shabbos to bring the Paschal sacrifice? Because the sacrifice that can be brought after Shabbos is not allowed to be brought on Shabbos. So Hillel was saying this is a communal sacrifice, and the time to bring this sacrifice is on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. There's no 15th day, there's no 13th day. And therefore, if not now, when? There'll never be another time to bring the Paschal sacrifice until next year. So we can't push it off. So this statement can be read all about the Paschal sacrifice. In the words of the Rebbe, text 9 on page 134. If I am not for myself, who is for me means that essentially the Passover sacrifice is a personal one. Every individual must bring his own offering purchased with his own money and be a part of his own group. But on the other hand, Hillel continues, and if I am only for myself, what am I? Meaning, the sacrifice must have the properties of a communal sacrifice. And moreover, if it were only a personal offering, only for myself, it would override the Shabbos. Well, it wouldn't override the Shabbos. I guess it's a typo. And Hillel himself never would have become the Nasi, the leader. Thus he says, what would I be? Now we can ask, even if the Passover sacrifice is a communal affair, a communal sacrifice only overrides the Shabbos if it is one that cannot be brought on any other day. Therefore, Hillel says, if not now, when? Meaning that the Passover sacrifice can only be brought on the 14th of Nisan. So that's what Hillel is telling them. Hillel is telling them this powerful idea. If I am not for myself, who is for me? In other words, I have to be myself. I can't go ahead and imitate other people. I can't go ahead and be just like the other person. I have to be my true self. I have to be the person I was born to be, the person that God put me on this world to be. And I have to be the best I can be at it. But once I recognize that I'm the best I can be at it, Hillel continues. Like the Paschal Lamb, it has to have those communal aspects. Because my identity is for my people. The collective unit. If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Expresses this idea that if not now, when? It's got to be a communal sacrifice that overrides the Shabbos. Because that's where I have to put my personal growth, anchor it in the community and see what I can do for the greater good. This idea, the balance between individual and the collective, is relative not only to ourselves, but also in our relationships with others. There are two ways of looking at it. The Talmud tells us a very powerful law. When it comes to situations, terrible situations amongst Israel, if there's rough times, there are certain instances where the sages institute a fast day. To fast, to not eat, not drink, just like on Yom Kippur, but it was done on a regular Tuesday and a regular Monday or Thursday, and the Jewish people would fast. It's not so common these days, but it does happen occasionally. Where a community takes upon themselves a fast for a certain situation, that happens. And the Talmud tells us an interesting law regarding these fasts. Any fast day that does not include sinners of Israel is not an effective fast. Really? Doesn't include the sinners is not an effective fast? On the contrary, they don't really care about Hashem. They don't care about Judaism. They don't care about anything. They're sinners. They don't do anything. Why do I must include them in these fast days? And if not, it's not effective. This is what Hillel is teaching us. Hillel is teaching us that every single Jew is important. We all have an individual identity, and this individual identity is important. It's so important that we have to love every single person just like we love ourselves. How are we able to love every person just like we love ourselves? This law in the Talmud teaches us that. Every person is important. Every person has a soul, has a divine soul, part of the Almighty. Every single individual has to be there by that fast, because we're all one, we're all part of a collective community. But every individual is part of this collective community. And so without this individual, we're not whole, we're not a collective community if we're missing the individuals with everything that comes with them. And that's why we have to love everyone like ourselves, because we're all necessary for the collective unit. But it goes even deeper than that. We all need each other. Where do we see that? In the words of the Alter Rebbe from text 11, everyone possesses a quality in which they surpass others, a quality for which others need you. Using the body as an analogy, it is true that the feet are the lowest part and the head is the highest and most impressive. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, the feet have an advantage in that one cannot walk without them. They also serve to hold up the body and the head, and so the head is not complete without the feet. Similarly, the Jewish people comprise one body, even if someone thinks that they are like a head compared to someone else. The truth is you cannot be complete without that person. That person is in fact filling in something you are lacking. With this mindset, one will feel humble before others and not try to identify who is a head and who is a foot. This humility brings unity, bringing down God's presence among us. So yes, the foot can't do anything without the head telling it to do it, but you know what? The head can't go anywhere without the foot bringing it there. And so in essence, we have to love every single person because yes, every individual, the way they are, their personality, their qualities, their strengths, and they have strengths that no one else has. They have strengths which are greater than us. Each one is a necessary component for the greater good, for the collective unit. Each individual, as they are, is necessary. So we have to love everyone equally because you know what? If that person wasn't there, however important I may think I am, that person is equally important in their own way. And I can't get the job done without them, and they can't get the job done without me and without the third person. We're all a necessary component and we all complete each other. And the Alter Rebbe takes it in a greater step. Looking at it from a soul perspective, it's impossible to know whose soul is greater. And the soul and the spirit, who can know their greatness and quality and their root and source in the living God? God put each person on this world with their own soul, with their own qualities, with their own strengths, with their own weaknesses. And they're all necessary because if they weren't necessary, God wouldn't put them on this world. And so each one of us, each individual that we encounter has a unique mission that's necessary for the collective mission of the world. And so Hillel is teaching us this idea that we need to have the collective unit preceded by the personal identity. And once we have the personal identity and we make sure that that personal identity is rooted in the collective unit, in the collective identity, by recognizing the power of each individual and how each complements each other. Each one may be greater than each other. Each one has a unique God-given mission that no one else has. That is the way that we can have a proper Paschal sacrifice. That is the way we can have a proper personal identity and collective identity. And so that's what this week's Torah portion, that's what Hillel is teaching us from the laws of the Paschal sacrifice. That we have to recognize the perfect balance between our personal identity and our collective identity. One isn't more or less important than each other, but they have to work together in harmony for it to bring about a better society and for it to bring about better ourselves. And that's why it says, if we look in text, if you have the books, text 13 and 14, when it comes to talks about the coming of Mashiach, God says that I'll do both of them. Text 13 in Jeremiah, God says, "Behold, I bring them from the north country and gather them from the uttermost ends of the earth, the blind and the lame among them, the pregnant and birthing women, all together a great company shall they return there. That the collection of the exiles with the coming of Mashiach, the redemption will be everyone together, the collective unit." But then in Isaiah, text 14, the verse tells us that God will also redeem each one of us by our hand. "And it shall come to pass on that day that God shall gather from the flood of the river to the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O children of Israel." So we're not just loved because we are part of the collective Jewish unit. God will personally take each one of us by the hand to the promised land, each one according to their needs. May that be speedily in our days with the coming of Mashiach.